Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in tonight.
Hi.
Hello. It's a good evening in Des Moines, Iowa. So you are listening to Shox&Rocks right now. We are talking tonight about drugs and substance abuse. So what is Shox&Rocks? Shox&Rocks, this show is all about putting a rock in your shoe or giving you a shock in your shoe. So rocks, what is that? Like a little thing that gets stuck in your shoe. You're walking along, you have to stop, think about it a little bit, take it out. A shock is like a Nike shock. You know, it gives you a little spring in your step, motivates you forward. We want this show to challenge you and encourage you. And so today, like I said before, we are talking about drugs, alcohol, and substance abuse. And so I've got three guests with us tonight. Do you guys want to all just introduce yourselves, give us your name, a little bit about you, and for a fun icebreaker question, what is your worst or best sunburn story?
All right, I can go first. My name is Jordan Anderson. My worst sunburn story, I was overseas and it was snowing out and we were on patrol all day long, and so there's no clouds though, and so the sun was just kind of reflecting off the snow. When you're in the military, you have to wear a helmet, so I had my chin strap that went down the side of my face and over my chin and under it, and I had sunglasses, and so my sunburn, it was completely white, pasty all the way across my chin. It looked like I had a chin strap, like facial hair, but it was just my pasty skin, and then everything else was like beet red and blistered because I was out there for so long. So it was pretty funny. We had weird tans for most of the year. So yeah. Was I supposed to say anything else?
Maybe who you are. I mean,
I said my name.
Okay, yeah, that's enough.
Okay.
All right, I'm Garrett Witzenberg. I think my worst sunburn deals with reflection off the sun or off the water as well. But we went kayaking, and I typically neglect to wear sunscreen because I'm a proud person, and I think that it's not going to affect me. And when you sit out in the sun on the water for 3 hours in August, yeah, you're bound to get sunburned. So, the next day I was pretty crispy red, and that lasted probably for about a week and a half, where I was kind of shedding some skin. So, needless to say, lesson is not always learned. I still don't wear sunscreen sometimes. So,
I think during summer, it's like the sunburn will tell you like who struggles with pride the most. You know what I mean? It's like you'll see it and be like, oh, sin.
Yeah, that dude right there.
That's sin there.
Yes.
That's sin.
Indeed.
Don't
Pride.
My name is Sean Trammell, and my worst sunburn I ever had in my life, I was in Belize on a service trip, and we took one day to go snorkeling. And like my German-skinned complexion companions here, I am also proud and do not wear sunscreen. And it doesn't usually cause too much problem here in America. I also have some Native American blood in me, so my skin tans pretty well. But in the closer to the equator, in more tropical environment, there's not quite as much coverage, and the sunlight's a little bit more direct. And I was snorkeling with my back facing the very direct equator sun for hours. And it was beautiful, by the way. You could see all the way down to the bottom of the ocean floor. It was gorgeous, but my back was not gorgeous in the hotel room later. So, yes, bright red. It's the reddest I've ever seen on skin before. And it was the worst.
How'd you sleep that night?
So, not well.
On your
On your
belly?
Not well,
stomach.
Gary. Not well.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Well, I've never sunburned before, so we can get right into the questions.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
No,
sure.
I'm just kidding. Once I got sunburned so bad, I was like studying abroad in France, and we were down like on the Mediterranean, and like I got so badly sunburned on my back, I literally had scars like the next summer, like scars on my back, and that was pretty intense.
You forgot the bubbles.
Yeah. Oh, that's like, why does that happen? I guess like
Blisters.
maybe. Yeah.
Sean might know.
Yeah.
Breakdown of the underlying skin layer. And then it collects fluid.
Oh, wow, that's disgusting.
It is. Yeah.
Don't pop those. by
You
the
should
way.
wear sunscreen.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Don't
wear sunscreen.
I'm a hypocrite, but you should wear sunscreen.
Do as I say, not what I do.
That's right. That doesn't work, but yes.
All right. Well, let's jump into our first questions. So we've got a couple of prepared questions here. But just as a reminder, we are going to be answering your guys' questions at the end of the show. So please be putting your questions about drugs and alcohol and other types of substance abuses in the comments. We will be feeding them into this computer here, and we will be able to ask these questions at the end of the show. So make sure you send your questions in. We'd love to be able to answer them. So just to start off, I'd like to just ask you guys, like, what your experience has been with this subject. Like, have you guys, how have you guys dealt with this idea of like drugs and alcohol and like types of substance abuses, either personally or professionally? Like, what's your interaction with this topic?
I can go first. So I've been a Christian for about 5 years now, but prior to that, post-deployment from about 2010-ish to 2015, I was an alcoholic. I drank typically a bottle of hard liquor almost every day for about 5 years, so I was completely dependent on it. I couldn't function really without it. I thought I needed it for just about everything. Kind of really took it on as like my identity of who I was, like, you know, and it helped me cope with a lot of painful things, and so it was more just a slow destruction of my life and my body, and so yeah, that's my experience with alcohol, substance abuse, and I would say recreational drug use as well, marijuana, cocaine. Yeah, so that's my personal experience with this. So
Yeah, I think I started using marijuana and drinking alcohol when I was 14, and like Jordan alluded to, it was a solution in my life. People talk about drugs and alcohol as a problem, but it was a solution to me. It brought a lot of relief from some of the different things I felt like I was going through. A lot of them real, some of them real, most of them made up. And so it brought a lot of relief for me. And then fast forward 2 years, I started getting into some pop culture drugs like ecstasy. Got my hands on LSD, mushrooms. And then about a year after that, I started to get into prescription pain pills, and prescription anti-anxiety medications called Xanax and different things like that, and would abuse those. And that's kind of what really took me down the darkest path, was the prescription pain pills and the opiates. But I would basically use whatever I could, and this was all, I've been a Christian for almost 10 years now, and that was all pre-Christ. And I think the whole inside of me that could only be filled with God, I filled with drugs and alcohol. And for a while, it was something that I enjoyed, but that joy or that enjoyment turned to pain rather quickly, and a lot of consequences because of it. But I'm grateful for the experiences I've gone through, because that pain is what led me to Christ. If I hadn't gone through that, I don't think in and of myself I would be humble enough to get on my knees and pray to God, because I would have thought I had everything together. So,
my experience with these things is threefold. So for my personal experience, freshman year of college, I was a pretty heavy drinker, probably 3 to 4 nights a week, was pretty close to blacked out drunk. Lots of partying, just lots of wild things there. Was not a believer at the time. And then I became a believer when I was 19, sophomore year. And then when I was 21, I was working for a summer program. And none of my coworkers were believers, and I had a desire to share Christ with them, and they were all going out to the bars. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll just join them, and I can socially drink so that I can kind of fit in with them now that I'm 21. But then I can tell them about Christ. And what ended up happening was almost every time I'd end up getting drunk and then be kind of belligerent. And if I did end up talking about Christ, it fell on drunk ears and was forgotten by the next day. Just my time with them was not fruitful. And so I have not drank since that summer. That was kind of my personal exposure. From my family's standpoint, my grandfather was an alcoholic for 3 decades. My father was an alcoholic for a decade. My sister struggles still to this day with drug abuse for about the past 15 years or so. And so there's a lot of addiction and substance use in my family that I've kind of been exposed to or been affected by in one way or another. And then professionally, I work as a physician at a hospital in a local, like one of our local hospitals here in town. And so I see people on drugs and alcohol and substances literally on the daily. I just delivered a baby this morning, and the mom tested positive for methamphetamine, which caused her baby to not be breathing very well and had to have a lot of intervention with that. But I also see 20-year-olds that are in heart failure because of their drug use, or people that have infections in their heart because of their IV drug use, and a 19-year-old who even died from that. And I mean, I see a wild amount of things that are all kind of tied back to drugs and substances in the workplace, and how it affects people's lives socially and health-wise, and a lot of things. And so, I feel like I have a pretty big exposure to these kinds of things. But
Yeah, I don't think I said this at the beginning of the show, but I just wanted to really come out and say, like, I'm so thankful that you guys are all here and able to talk with us about these topics. You know, like, it's like obviously like very personal in all of your lives, and it's like, I imagine a subject that's has like a lot of pain in your guys' history, but it is like a blessing to us that you guys are able to, that you're willing to share these stories and like talk about what happened in your life and like what God is doing in your life now. So I don't know if I said that at the beginning, but thanks so much for being willing to share with us tonight. Just kind of going back to what your guys' stories were, a lot of you had a connection between your like victory in this area of like addiction and like your faith, or like your walk with God. Could you tell us a little bit more about like how your faith, whether it was like becoming a Christian or like after you were a Christian, has like interacted with your like struggle in this area?
Yeah. I mean, alcohol was like, I was completely dependent on it. And so when I came to Christ, when I recognized my sin for what it was, alcohol for me was a distraction from like the heart condition. I was a wretched man, and I was guilty for all of these things that I had done, and I like knew that God was there, but I felt so disgusting that I could not be accepted by him. And so especially from a lot of decisions that I had made overseas and post. And so when I came to Christ, like legitimately the week, I think it was the night before, I was like completely like drunk, and my parents invited me to church, and it was in that moment that I realized that everything that had happened was not because God hated me, but he loved me and would receive me and forgive me of my sin despite my treacherous addiction to alcohol. And that really gave me victory and confidence over that sin. I actually haven't had a drink of alcohol in like 4 years now. And so, but the way that I connect that connects, the victory over that is one, I don't ever want to go back to that kind of way of living. I like hated it myself. And what alcohol was for me was something to make me feel like I was better, or that I could do something, or to forget. But I don't want to forget now, because I know that I'm secure in Christ, that I'm deeply loved and known by the Creator of everything. And so I don't need to fill that void in my heart. It's filled with Christ and the community of believers that I have, and so that is like, I'm not, if that answers your question specifically, but that is what drastically changed in my life, from like the dependency and the feeling the need for it. I still crave the taste of it and like the feeling of being drunk, but I know that it's destructive and that it wreaks havoc in my life, and it leads me away from Christ and a relationship with him. And so that's what I'd say about that.
Yeah, Good words, Jordan. I definitely agree with you on that. I think for me, I was so dependent. Like I would wake up and it was not a decision. It was just, this is what I'm gonna do. It was, I need to get drunk. I need to get high. I need to get something to make me feel okay. And so, like, the initial steps to me getting sober really was me humbling myself to God as I saw God. You know, I didn't have any theological kind of understanding of who God was. You know, I didn't know the Bible. It was out of a sense of pain that I saw, even like called out his name. You know, I was like, God, if you're real, like, help me, take this away from me, because like Jordan alluded to, I was disgusted with myself. I didn't really care for myself. I knew the things that I had done were I had a conscience. God gives us all a conscience, and I chose to sear it over and over again. And, you know, because of that, I was not happy with the decisions I made. And so mine started off, you know, it was basically like, God, if you're real, like, just help me. And, you know, slowly but surely, like, people entered my life. Things started to happen that were just kind of not coincidental, you know, like, they were just, like, I started to get introduced to people, and then I started, you know, reading my Bible, and then I got connected with the Walnut Creek Church, and yeah, all of this along the way, you know, it wasn't only that initial cry out for help but it was like a daily sort of discipline that I had to establish in my life, because before I got sober, I was very undisciplined, very lazy, very unmotivated, very slothful. I had to start trying, and before that, I really didn't care, you know, and so I had to start caring, and you know, it started with a simple prayer, and then after that, I had to kind of take some actions and do some things for myself. So
yeah, for me, the reason actually why I started drinking was because not for the purpose of you know, anything with substances or anything like that, like for something internal, but it's because it made me cool. So I wasn't very popular growing up, but then, once I started drinking in college, people really started liking me, and I started being really affirmed by that. And so that's what kind of motivated my use, was just for people to like me. And I think once I stopped drinking at the end of my freshman year, actually, because I got in trouble with the law, and I always wanted to be a doctor, so I knew that I couldn't have a lengthy criminal record. So I quit drinking for that reason. But then it kind of, lengthy.
A couple things.
Yeah.
No big deal.
Right, yeah. But yeah, so that kind of shook me up. But then I realized I was really empty. You know, I was really broken, and I was no longer being affirmed by anybody. I lost all my friends as soon as I stopped drinking and didn't have any other friends to fall back on. And so the friends that I ended up making by God's grace were believers. One in particular who just loved the crap out of me when I was probably the most unlovable I've ever been. And I just couldn't understand, like, why he cared about me the way that he did. And then to come to find out that God cared about me more than anybody else on the whole planet. Like, what more affirmation could I possibly desire than the one that holds the entire universe in his hands would look at me and say, yeah, you're worth me dying for. Mm-hmm. And that just, it blew my mind that God would care for me that much. And I was just so desperate for intimacy, relationship, and I found fulfillment in that in Christ. And so, that was kind of how it played out for me, was seeing, alcohol just was kind of an avenue to something that God was freely offering, that wasn't destructive for me. But
thanks for sharing that, guys. So I think we're gonna dip in a little bit more now to more, not like technical things, but I guess I guess all of these things that we're talking about, like, will be relating to your guys' personal stories, but I kind of wanted to open with that just so we kind of can know going in what your guys' backgrounds are. And so I guess, like, next off, I just want to, as we're kind of continuing this conversation, I want to talk about, like, what addiction is. And so I personally don't have a lot of experience with this topic. And so I was just wondering, like, what is a good working definition that we can use as, like, a background going forward? For me, like, the most I hear about addiction is, like, oh, like, the kids these days are addicted to their phones, or you think about that show, like, My Strange Addiction or whatever. Like, what even is addiction? Like especially for viewers that we might have that might be more unfamiliar with this idea, or maybe they might have addictions but don't recognize them as that.
Yeah, so we use something called the DSM-5 in psychiatric medicine, and so it's kind of like a evidence-based guidelines book that contains like definitions for things. And so I wrote out the diagnostic criteria for addiction, and so it doesn't have to be a yes to every one of these, but like if the more of these that are true, the more likely that it's an addictive process. And so first one is taking larger amounts of the substance over a longer period of time than you intended. Second is a persistent desire and unsuccessful effort to cut down or control your use. Third is a great deal of time is lost spent acquiring, using, or recovering from use. Fourth is cravings and urges to use a substance. Fifth is recurrent use resulting in failure to fulfill obligations at work or at home. Next is continued use despite adverse effects in your work, social, and family life. Next is important activities are given up because of your use. The next one is recurrent use, even in physically hazardous situations. Next is continued use despite knowledge of the adverse effects on your physical health. Next is development of tolerance, and then the last one is withdrawal.
Okay. And so for that, is like all of those have to be present for it to be addiction, or is it like those are like a certain, like any of those being present means it could be an addiction?
Yeah, so you don't have to have all of them for it to be an addiction, but the more of those that you would say yes to, the higher likelihood that it is an addictive process. So
could you say that like addiction isn't just like a physical thing, but also like a mental or psychological issue as well?
Absolutely.
Like not becoming dependent just physically, but also mentally, psychologically as well.
Yeah. Your brain is actually very plastic, which is just a way of saying that it can change and mold and is shaped by your environment and by the things that that you face and that come into your body. And so substances of every kind will influence the way that your brain develops, even when you're older, and will change the way that your brain functions. And so there is a reward pathway that exists inside your brain. There's a few different structures inside your brain that make up this reward pathway. One of them is your memory center. So your memories get linked with how you felt about the situation, which then will drive you towards more things that are like that memory if it's positive, or more things away from that type of memory if it's negative. There's also a fear center in that center of the brain. So again, if your fear is driven up by something, then you'll remember, and then you'll have the fear stimulus, and that will provoke you to not go towards that thing again. And so, and then there's also the pleasure center. So that's also found in this reward pathway. And so this is where your brain releases the chemicals that give you the good, euphoric sense that can come from exercise or hug from a loved one or getting some really good news and those types of things. And so that's all a very natural process in your brain. When you start to use substances, what happens is the substances actually hijack that system. So alcohol drives away your fear, and it impairs your memory formation ability. So that limits you from even remembering the bad things that were happening, which will promote you more towards that thing, especially if forgetting something is what you're trying to accomplish. Many of the illegal substances that people use, they release a very, very high dose of that pleasure hormone that exists in your brain. And so it's not something that you can naturally achieve. It's only through this synthetic option that you could get to that level. And so people are constantly craving that euphoria again and again and again. There's almost nothing like it inside your brain. And your brain, it adapts to what it's being exposed to. So if you get exposed to that huge surge of those pleasure hormones from a drug, and then you get some good news at work, and it gives you maybe half the dose of that pleasure hormone, then you couldn't hardly care less, because it's not enough. Right. It's not what you were getting before. And so it teaches your brain almost that like nothing else is worth my time. Like I need that thing that gave me what it was. But your brain's response to those hormones actually also decreases as you get exposed to it more and more and more. So then that's why people, if maybe they could use a certain dose of heroin or something like that and give them one effect, they might need double that dose to get the same effect a month later. And that's why people end up overdosing, because they're constantly cranking up their dosage, trying to get back to that original level that they were receiving in the beginning, and they end up taking too much and their body can't handle it. But yeah, so addiction, it absolutely changes the way that your brain functions, the way that you think. The way that I would describe it is telling an addict to stop like having urges or to stop like being tempted towards their desire is like telling a normal person not to take a drink of water when they're thirsty. It's that instinctive. I mean, there's just like a natural impulse that gets created inside of the body and brain. And so I think that's important to recognize.
Yeah, I mean, even as you're talking about that, I'm just like picturing different times when I would be just drinking. And everything you're describing is just like exactly how I felt or what I wanted or I was craving at the time. But I didn't have I couldn't put my finger on it. It's just like I felt like I needed it. I had to have it. And it did make it, that's crazy, it did make everything else just seem completely pointless. It just numbed everything. And without it, it just seemed like life was just dull and irrelevant and hopeless. So.
I think it's kind of interesting how it points to kind of the fallen nature of our brain too. Mm-hmm. Like even the things that are the worst for us give us the most pleasure. Mm-hmm. And it's like we're subject to the fall of Adam, It's like even the things that are going to kill me eventually are the things I get the most pleasure from, And I think I constantly have to redirect my brain to tell, because we're always looking for the easiest route to pleasure. We always are, and I constantly have to redirect my brain and say, no, actually that's going to lead, because that easy route to pleasure eventually will lead to pain. And but the harder route, which may be, studying a book or doing some hard math problems or going for a long run, those are the kind of things that like my brain doesn't want to do naturally. And so those are the type of things, if I'm looking for a natural high, I have to put in some work. And I don't want to do that. And so, addiction is like, you're just constantly chasing that feeling that is going to get you the shortcut to where you want to go.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And even like kind of extending off of that, what was the point where you realized that your interaction with these substances was like a problem, or was an addiction and it wasn't just something that exists? And what was the point that you guys realized that? And then how can people see that in their own life? How can people like look at their own habits and be like, wait, this is actually not normal. This is a problem. I think like that definition was a really good one, and it's probably a way that a lot of people could look back and say like, oh, like I meet more of those criteria that I'm comfortable with. But like, what was it for you? And like, what would you say to people that are maybe thinking about this for the first time?
I think that there was always something in me that was saying that it actually wasn't that big of a deal. But there were guys that I like had deployed with who were also kind of crazy, like combat infantrymen who had said, Jordan, I think you have a problem. And I just would kind of like shrug it off and like, whatever, you guys are just trying to mess with me. But then when I started to yell at my parents, and I started to lose and destroy my relationships, and when I would wake up and have no money in my bank account because I blew all of it on alcohol and drugs, and it like people that always had cared about me, I could just, even like inside of me, there was something that was like, I don't even want to be around them because I don't want them to hear or talk about like the things that I'm doing. And so that's when I think I really started to realize like this is destroying my life. But there was even part of me that was like, I don't even care. Like truthfully, it's like I don't even care. They probably all hate me anyway. And I think what those substances was doing was also kind of fueling this like self-destruction. And what substances do, like when we abuse them, is it lowers our like immunity to like deception and lies that like the enemy he wants to destroy you. He wants to annihilate you. You know, he is a roaring lion looking to devour you. And those things were just fueling my mind in my life. And so I think when other people, to answer your question, when other people started to say, I think this is an issue, and it was destroying my especially my relationship with my parents, that's when it was like, it became more real to me.
Yeah, I think I knew that I kind of was. My dad wasn't kind of an alcoholic. He wouldn't necessarily admit it, but he drank pretty heavily, so it was kind of in my genes. I have other family members who are alcoholics as well, so I kind of knew that I was messing with dangerous stuff when I kind of started getting into this. But I think when I was probably 19 or 20. And I started kind of having some withdrawal symptoms, and I started sweating at night and not being able to sleep and just like craving pretty hard. That it kind of popped in my head that this doesn't seem right. This is not really about the party anymore. This is about like me. Like, this is kind of getting hardcore here. And there was a part of me that said, I guess like, people started to point out to me, like, hey, yeah, you're probably using too much, you're probably drinking too much. But like Jordan said, there was a part of me that said, I just don't really care. I just don't really care. And I kind of just felt like, well, I'm just going to ride this train till it stops. And that was a dark place for me to be in, because when you accept your sin as being okay, that's when everything goes out the window, and you start doing things you never want to do again. And and then I finally when I finally did get sober, I finally realized for myself that I was losing control. I was powerless. I had to surrender. But people told me it over and over, and my family would say, hey, like, you're going on the wrong path. Like, it's not like my family was a bad family. They were very loving and caring for me, and they knew that I was going down the wrong path, but I ignored them, and I just didn't care, and living reckless and not really caring. But until a person gets to the point where they realize for themselves that they are this, or they have this issue themselves, and not their parents are telling them that, or people are telling them that, then they'll never get sober. They got to realize for themselves that this is their issue, and stop blaming others.
Yeah, I think for me, the turning point was kind of, getting busted and then having some legal issues and things like that. What I think was interesting for me was I stopped drinking, but then, almost immediately just replaced that with something else. And so it was either pursuing friendships elsewhere, or just pursuing academic success, or even like video games or movies, just like anything that I could, just to like fill in my life with something. And it was almost through that experience, just recognizing, kind of like Garrett, you touched on this earlier, but like, our souls just have this like bottomless hole in them that like we try to fill with all kinds of things, and nothing quenches that desire except the Lord. It's just like, until I found Christ, like I felt empty no matter how much I filled myself up with something. And so that was kind of the turning point for me too, is just realizing, I mean, you can turn anything into a problem. Like, you can turn anything into an addiction or to an idol, and some of those things are maybe a little bit more positive for you. So maybe exercise is your addiction. And it's like, okay, physically that's healthy for you, but spiritually, if that's how you're like dealing with all of your problems, like, it's going to wear out eventually. Like, it's not going to take you to the end. Only the Lord can do that. And so I think that was a big eye-opening recognition for me, was just, I'm never going to find something that actually fully satisfies me permanently in this life. And Jesus has done that and will do that for all of eternity, which is awesome. But yeah, so I think that was probably for me.
Yeah. So I think like as we've been talking, like a major theme obviously is like the way that like the Lord has like shaped your like view of your like your journey with like different substances. But I'd love to like focus in on that and like talk more about like what Scripture says about like alcohol and drugs and like like addictions of all kinds. But I guess like a good opening point is like what have been passages or like scriptures that have been like helpful for you or guiding for you as you're thinking about this topic. Like are there specific places that have just been encouraging or challenging for you specifically when thinking about this topic of like alcohol or drugs or any of these things?
Mm-hmm.
I think in First Peter talks about having a sober mind and being prepared as one who has a sober mind, and you know, like Sean talked about, it's not only alcohol. You know, it's you know, he's not only talking about being sober from alcohol there. So you know, really, you know, meditating on things like that, and realizing that God calls me to have a sober mind, not because he wants to punish me, not because he doesn't want me to have fun, but because he wants me to be happy. He wants me to be joyful. And the way I was doing it was not the right way, you know, and so like having a sober mind is like really the way that he calls me to live, and it's because it's for my good, you know. And I found that to be true. You know, when I'm in a stupor, I'm not happy. I was never really happy drunk. It was like, it was, most of the time, when I was in the grip of it, it sucked. And if anyone's struggling, you know that firsthand. You know how you don't want to be where you're at right now. And, you know, God, the scripture that he gives us is for me, and he gives it in a way that he wants to bring the purpose for humanity to being. And so yeah, I found that scriptures like that to be pretty helpful in my walk. So
I think something that would be helpful, I think we can, you know, everyone in the audience who's watching this, people, I think most of us, I would hope that the majority of you would say, yeah, like alcoholism is bad, like hard drugs are not good, you know. But what about, like, what does the Bible say about, you know, like just drinking in general? You know, we talked about, like, substance abuse. Like, when does it become wrong? When is it sin? And so the Bible actually talks about alcohol a lot, like, all over the Old and New Testament. You know, and so, like, is drinking alcohol wrong? You know, that's something that I had to, like, confront and think about as, like, a Christian man who struggled with alcohol severely in the past. And the Bible talks much about like drunkenness and what Garrett was like alluding to, like having a sober mind. And so as Christians, you know, we're speaking to the Christian now, I think that you want to be like above reproach. You want to have a sober mind. You want to be able to represent Christ as an ambassador. And if alcohol is an issue for you or leads you into temptation or causes you to not be sober-minded, to think clearly, to walk by the Spirit, to walk in faith, then that's when it is sin. And so drunkenness is wrong, is sin. To have like a beer or a glass of wine, I don't think that that's sin. I personally won't. I can't go anywhere near it. I know that if I had a sip, it's going to trigger everything and I'll want to just get wasted that night. But I know that in Ecclesiastes, it talks about how we ought to drink wine with a merry heart. Psalm 104 says, God gives wine that makes glad the heart of men. And so there are a lot of things that God has blessed the world with that we as humans use for our destruction. It's like a twisted view, or we use it or manipulate it for the wrong ways. Alcohol is one of them. And so, I mean, Jesus' first miracle, he turned water into wine. Didn't mean that he indulged in it and was drunk. I personally don't think that there's a reason for alcohol, but I have a firm stance because of my past. But from a biblical standpoint, I think that these are the kind of convictions that you want to read God's word. I don't think that anywhere in God's word it says that thou shalt not drink, you know, any alcohol. But it does say that you must not be drunk, that you must have a sober mind, that you are bought with a price, that you are not your own. So glorify God with your body. And so if alcohol or, you know, marijuana or whatever it is causing you to walk away from that, then that's when it's sin and it's an issue in your life, I believe. So.
Yeah, I think it's important to also know that, alcohol in and of itself is not the evil here. It's how I what I do with it. I create the idol. I take something and I indulge in it to the point where it becomes sin. And so I'm not trying to tell everyone out there that alcohol is, if you drink a beer or a glass of wine, then that's bad. And I used to kind of have that perspective, and it's not the right perspective, in my opinion, to have. I've been corrected. I was corrected by my wife, actually, who said, hey, maybe you are kind of harsh on other people. And she's right, because if I'm allergic to peanuts, and then I say, hey, Sean, like, why are you eating a peanut? I'm allergic to it. He'd be like, what do you mean? I like peanuts. It's like I can't push that conviction on him because I can't have it. And so I think it's, give the grace, and then, be hard on myself and allow God to transform me. But if someone else has a different conviction, then that's for them and God to work out.
I think the question, can I drink alcohol, is probably a popular one. Mm-hmm. But I would assert that that's actually the wrong question. I don't think that it's wise actually to ask yourself questions like that. I think a better question is, should I drink alcohol?
Yep.
And so I think a lot of times we're looking for, what is the line that I have to be on this side of? And it doesn't matter how close I am to the line, as long as I'm on this side of the line, I'm good. I think instead it should be, what is best? What's going to be the best possible way that I spend my time or my money or my energy or my life? And so I think in order to answer that question, you actually have to first ask yourself, what am I doing with my life? What is the purpose of my life? And so I think if the purpose of your life is, as our church's mission statement is, to make authentic disciples of Jesus Christ who love and serve God in everything that they do, then that's maybe one motivator of life. Where on the other hand, if your motivator of life is, well, I'm just, kind of trying to do the right thing and not, step over too many bounds and, do what I can to kind of do some of the things the Bible says, but I'm also just kind of living my life, and that's it. Then that's another side of the spectrum. And so I think you have to ask yourself what you're trying to do with your life. And I think, so Matthew 6:33, it says, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and then all of the rest will be added to you. So I think the overwhelming kind of attitude of the scriptures is that we're first to look to God and see, God, what are you doing? And then what would you have me do in response to what you're doing? And then based on that should then drive the decisions that you're making about the rest. And God says the rest will be added to you. And so I think it's okay, well, God, what is best for your kingdom? What is best for people coming into faith to know you? What is the best example that my life can set that will point people to you? What are the best decisions that I can be making to position myself so that people are hearing the gospel, they're seeing the gospel being lived out in my life? And then ask yourself, so based on those questions, should I be drinking or should I be doing X? And I think it's a question you do have to kind of answer for yourself in some ways. But I just think the Bible, I don't think clearly says you shall do this and you shall not do that about a lot of things that are gray in the Christian life. But what the Bible does provide is principles that can kind of help guide and shape the way that you make decisions. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know. In my humble opinion has been that if somebody, particularly in our culture in this time period, sees me drinking alcohol, even if I'm drinking in moderation and fully within my bounds of not becoming drunk, what's their assumption going to be? In the American culture today, the assumption is going to be that I'm getting drunk because that's just what people do in our culture. And so I've kind of likened it a little bit to if I was living with a girlfriend that I was not married to, I could go up and down the street telling everybody, we're not having sex, we sleep in different bedrooms, we're not sleeping together. But what's the automatic assumption from everybody is going to be that we're sleeping together because we're living together. And me having to justify that the way that I'm living is actually within the bounds of the scriptures, I think it detracts and distracts a lot from my witness for Christ. And so that my humble position and opinion has been, I don't think it actually makes sense to drink alcohol even a little bit if your intent is that you want every area of your life to reflect Christ so that you can make authentic disciples of him. who love and worship God in all they do. So that's my 2 cents, something that I would encourage people to wrestle through, and questions that you should probably ask yourself and ask others.
Yeah, I also think that you want to like respond to people like in love. So like for example, if we started a ministry in like Germany, you know, like it's pretty common that everyone has a beer with their dinner, you know. And if I'm being hosted by another, you know, group there, and they're like out of love, they serve food to me and they offer me this, you know, I think personally in my own experience, I just couldn't. But I think out of love, like it would be appropriate or okay to like receive that as a gesture of love for their hospitality and generosity to me. And so I think, Sean, you kind of brought up the point like earlier just about like water. You know, we could say the same thing about water. You know, if I'm next to a brother or sister who's in need and I'm drinking the water and they need it, is me drinking the water sin? Yeah, I'm putting my own needs before theirs. Well, it's kind of, I think, the way that we have to think about like substances as well, you know, and alcohol. It's like things that God has given us, we abuse in our sin and our selfishness and our pride. Alcohol is one of them. And so, but I definitely agree with much of what you guys are saying. And, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think this is a great jumping off point for our Q&A section. So you guys have been putting a lot of really great questions in the comments right now, and so we have time now for our last 15-ish minutes or so to address those. So we've got a pretty... Oh, no. Should I keep talking? You can still hear me? Cool, great. Well, basically, this is fine. Technical difficulty. Nice job, Sean.
Sorry. My fault entirely.
It's good.
I'm not going to be invited back.
No.
This is your last
Someone get him out. That's like when the big hook, you know?
Yes.
That pulls you off stage.
Get
Funny.
your stones ready. No, I'm just kidding.
Okay, so we've got a couple of questions about more specific things that people might struggle with in this area and what the Bible says about it. So I guess we could probably keep these pretty quick because maybe like 3 or 4 of them. But I guess first, smoking cigarettes. Do you guys think smoking cigarettes or vaping is sinful, or is it like, can a Christian do that in good conscience?
I think honestly, like around what Sean was saying, you know, Paul alludes to this. He says, you know, everything is permissible, and not everything is beneficial. And so, if you're thinking about it from only a scientific standpoint, like are cigarettes beneficial? I think you can checkbox every one of those as no. I don't think cigarettes actually add anything to you physically or mentally, as well as spiritually. And so if you're killing one area of your life, it's probably going to be bad for all of them. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I would say about that.
Sweet. Thanks, Jay, for that question. I feel like that's a pretty solid answer. We got a couple more. So, okay. How should Christians view prescription drugs? I guess like this is a huge topic because it really depends on like which prescription I imagine that you're talking about. But like in general, like drugs that you get prescribed, like how do we know what is okay and what is not okay? Thanks, Brian, for this question. What are okay drugs to take? What are not?
Mm-hmm. I would say, so one thing, Romans 13, 1 and 2, it tells us that we are to submit to the local authorities, the governing body. Mm-hmm. And it says that if you despise your authority, you actually are despising God and you have sinned against him. Yep. So one thing, it is illegal to use prescription drugs that are not prescribed to you by a licensed prescriber. So I think using someone else's prescriptions, even someone else's antibiotics, technically breaks the law, and then falls into that category. So that's one thing I would say, just to be cautious of. In terms of other prescription medications, I think that kind of has to be something you have to be able to identify in yourself as to whether or not it's a problem. If your doctor is prescribing you pain medications, then there's nothing illegal about you using them as they're prescribed and directed. But if you notice that you're becoming dependent on them, that you need them to function, that you're desiring more and more and more, that it's leading you down a path towards maybe some of those criteria that I listed earlier, then that's something that you have to self-regulate and be able to recognize, no, this is a problem. I need to find other alternatives, other interventions. And the medical community is getting much better about this because we've seen so many deaths associated with drug abuse, and prescriptions often tend to be the starting point because you can get them legally and then you can move from there. And so we are under heavy investigation of finding more and more ways to help manage things like pain and anxiety, depression, things like that without medications. But again, I think it's something you just kind of have to be able to regulate with that. I would just say get some accountability, have somebody in your life that you can actually talk to about these things, and get some perspective from outside yourself, because you are not to be trusted. Like in every single area of life, you're going to be biased towards your own sin, towards your own desires, and so I think having an outside look is helpful. But
Absolutely.
Okay, next one. This is going to be quite the hot button topic. I think
we go.
you all probably know what's coming.
Yeah.
This is pot. Marijuana. Like, how should
Yeah.
Christians think about marijuana? We got a couple more questions to go after this, so I'm probably going to have to like cut us off at some point. But
Okay.
like, how should Christians think about marijuana? Is it okay? I could imagine a person saying to what you were saying earlier, Jordan's like, oh, God has created like things for us to enjoy. God has like made things that we can accept. Like, is that a valid argument to apply to Christians using marijuana? What do you guys think?
Well, I think it depends on the context of which someone asks that question. You know, if someone is asking that question to justify their ounce of marijuana that they smoke every day just to get high, and, I think that's when it becomes an issue. Also, what Sean alluded to, obviously it doesn't necessarily go or extend to the entire country. It's not illegal everywhere. But yeah, we ought to submit to our governing authorities, and here in Iowa it is illegal. And so if you are smoking marijuana, then yes, I believe that you are in sin. But there are, I think, a lot of other things. One of them is impairment and like judgment. And so we ought to have a sober mind, like Garrett alluded to earlier, is like it also lowers our, I think, ability to like flee and from sin, from temptation, and we're also commanded to do that, And so those are just a few quick things that I think about.
Plus, eating a lot of Doritos is probably not good for you.
Yeah.
Gluttony is a sin. So
there was a study in the American Journal on Addictions that this was the statement from their conclusion. Marijuana use over time was significantly associated with increased health problems by the late 20s, including respiratory problems, general malaise, which means feeling unwell, neurocognitive problems, and lower academic achievement and functioning. So in my mind, I just think, okay, well, our objective, non-Christian, secular studies are showing that it has tons of adverse effects on your health and on your mental ability, and that's long-term. That's not, neurocognitive problems don't just flip a switch back to normal if you stop. And so my perspective is like what Jordan was saying, regardless of whether it's legal or not, it impairs your mind. It dulls your senses. It prevents you from being as sharp as really Christ would want you to be in order to obey the way that he's asked you to obey. And so I would not ever condone it to anybody. But
I've heard people describe it as well. It's like you can consume alcohol without becoming intoxicated or without becoming like you can like have it and still be sober minded, but like you can't like take pot or you can't like smoke pot. And you like every time you smoke pot, you get high. There's like not like an incremental thing. Is that like correct? Is that like a correct way of saying that? Like
I actually don't know.
Yeah,
Okay.
I can't like concretely say that, but I know that every time that I have smoked marijuana, I got high.
or you want to get high. Yeah, you're trying
or
to
the
get
point of
high.
it is to get
yeah.
high. It's like, why would you smoke? Like if that'd be like if me going out and just pulling a bunch of grass, rolling it up, and smoking it with zero effects. Like, why would you do that? You wouldn't do it. You know what I mean? Like,
It would
why?
taste terrible.
Yeah, it would. But I mean, marijuana doesn't taste great. I don't think, personal opinion. But it's like, why would you smoke it? Like, why would you inhale this substance into your lungs if it did not give you some sense of like rush or
Certainly
pleasure?
not for health benefits, as
Yeah.
we can
Yeah,
see. Which
it's
is like
like-
what a lot of people would say.
Yeah.
They'd say like,
Yeah.
oh,
The
there's
lungs
health-
were designed for air. And that's about it. So.
And so, like, and I say this smiling because it does seem just preposterous in some degree, but like, there are a lot of people that smoke. Like, I mean, I would say that the majority of people that are students that I talk to on campus who are not Christians smoke marijuana. The majority of them.
Yeah, I see
like-
it all the time.
Yeah. So.
I think too, like it being legal adds another degree of temptation. Honestly, for me, like I went to Colorado a year ago, and all these pot shops are around now. Like I wanted to smoke some pot. Like it smelled good. It like was desirable, and that's my sinful nature, obviously. But it was there, and so like, like it being legal, that's a very long question to answer. But I think to one point for a Christian is it does add a sense of temptation because it's now legal, and therefore you don't have to. You know, your conscience no longer has to wrestle with that. You know, it's legal.
Yeah.
So, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so a whole bunch of people just flooded with a couple of extra questions
Yeah,
about
I'm
different
sure.
types of things. We're not going to talk about whether or not caffeine is allowed for Christians or not.
Don't drink caffeine.
Google Google it.
I'd be in trouble.
Sorry,
man.
guys, it's a great question. But I think like a really great one from us to maybe end on is like what can people that maybe don't struggle with this, like what can you do to support friends that you know that struggle with this, that are maybe trying to get sober or trying to quit or trying to be free of this, or like, and how do we talk to people that are struggling with this but they don't see a need to break away from it, or they don't have that desire yet. And man, we also got 5 minutes, so again, this is going to be a speed round. Unfortunately, let's.
Yeah.
What do you guys got?
I think it's super easy to get frustrated with people when they're struggling with addiction and you don't, because you don't really understand what's going on in their internal world. But one thing that I've had to remind myself is that is how God sees me. Like day after day after day after day after day, God watches as I make all of the worst possible choices and commit sin left and right and think horrible things about people and say the stupidest things and knock cameras off of their stands and disrupt CF Live and all these things.
It's happened before, like multiple times.
No, it's perfect. No, but I just think it's like, yeah, God, he's just watching me as I do all of these dumb things, and he knows perfectly how much I'm wrecking my own life when I make those choices. And yet he just is so loving and so patient and so kind. He never gives up on me. He continues to love me through all of it. He allows me to suffer from consequences so I can learn. But he never leaves me, never forsakes me. And I just think, God, if you're going to extend that kind of grace to me as a guilty, wicked, depraved sinner, like how much more do I just need to extend grace to somebody who's struggling with something that I don't understand? Because I have plenty of struggles that they probably don't understand.
Yep.
And so I think just having that mentality will help soften like your reaction towards people a lot. Which is really, really helpful. In terms of nitty gritty, I mean, it can be situational. My sister, like I said, has struggled with drugs for 15 years, and my family and I have made lots of mistakes in the process of trying to be helpful, and sometimes have given way too much slack and allowed for worse things to happen, sometimes in way too stringent, which then resulted in breakdown of relationship. And we've made so many errors, I think, and I don't know how to like tell you how to navigate each individual situation, but I think that like framework of like the grace of God, like that needs to overflow from you towards these people.
I think something that's helpful to remember too is to not like downplay the situation of what they're talking about, what they're going through. It may seem preposterous or ridiculous to you if you have never struggled or have dealt with things like this, but that doesn't mean that it's not true. And even if it does seem ridiculous, it could be very serious to them. And so never like downplay what they're saying, but like extend grace in love and try to like help them. And if helping them means like directing them to like, you know, like a professional, like they need like help in that way, like then do that. You know, like I'm not a professional in that area, like some of these areas, and so there's like a limit or an extent of what I can do. I can encourage them. I can pray for them. You should always pray for them. Be so prayerful for these people. Like God is the one, we plant the seeds. God is the one who changes the heart. He is the one who gives new life. He's the one who went to the cross. And so like when we're engaging in just like the muck of people's lives, yeah, we should not downplay. We should extend grace, point them to Christ. We should pray for them, and we should direct them to maybe people who are more qualified to help them if that's what they need. And so, and be, you know, seek help and counsel and accountability with them. Like read the Bible with them. You know, like teach them God's word. So.
I think we're probably out of time maybe, but just one last thing that I would say.
Go for it.
Behavior modification is also not the goal. I think it can be so easy that I just want to squeeze people into like a cookie cutter of behavior.
Yep.
But I think if someone's not a believer and they're struggling with addiction, the solution is that they need to come to know Christ and he will set them free.
That's right.
And if they are a believer and they're struggling with addiction, then the solution is that they just need to fall more and more in love with Jesus and surrender more and more of their life, which is a process that he drives, not us. And so don't seek for behavior modification to be the goal. It's not the goal. Like point people to Jesus. He does the work we can't do. So.
Awesome. Thanks so much, you guys. With that, we're going to close for the night. Thank you so much, Garrett and Sean and Jordan, for being here. This was a great conversation. It was really encouraging for me. Hope it was helpful for you guys. We'll see you all here next week at the same time. Thank you, guys.